Karen slapped my grandma in a parking lot. Didn't know she's a retired cop. It was supposed to be a calm, easy afternoon. The sun was out, the sky was blue, and I had the rare day off to run errands with my grandma. She's in her late 70s now, a gentle soul with a sharp tongue when necessary and knees that don't always cooperate. She insisted we do the grocery shopping together, not because she needed help. Well, okay, maybe a little, but more because she liked the company. I never mind spending time with her. She raised me when my parents were out working long hours, and I owe her more than I could ever repay. She walks with a cane these days, slow and deliberate steps, but she moves with purpose, with quiet dignity that turns heads when people notice. The world doesn't always slow down for folks like her, though. Some people don't want to wait even 30 seconds for someone who isn't moving at their pace, and I learned that the hard way in the parking lot of the Miller & Co. supermarket. We had just exited the store after about an hour inside. My arms were full of bags, and I offered to run ahead and pull the car up so she wouldn't have to walk all the way across the hot asphalt. She waved me off and said she'd rather walk. "My legs still work," she said with a half smile. "They just like to argue with me first." So we walked together, slow but steady, heading for the far corner of the lot where we had parked. She hated parking up close, said it was unfair to people who really needed it, and refused to get a handicap placard even though she qualified for one years ago. We were about halfway across the lot when it started, a blaring horn that shattered the calm like a sledgehammer to glass. I turned, confused, expecting some teenager messing around with the wrong end of their steering wheel, but instead saw a pearl-white SUV idling aggressively behind us. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away, revving lightly, and behind the wheel was a woman in designer sunglasses, blonde hair pulled tight in a ponytail, and a scowl on her face like someone had just personally offended her. The window rolled down, and I kid you not, she actually shouted, "Move it, this isn't a crosswalk." I blinked. It wasn't a crosswalk, sure, but it was a parking lot, and we were just two people trying to get to our car. Grandma paused, looked back at her with that calm, unfazed face she wore even when scolding my uncles back in the day, and simply said, "I'm walking as fast as I can, dear." That should have been the end of it. Anyone with a shred of decency would have waited or pulled into a different aisle, maybe even gotten out and helped her with the bags. But not this woman. She cranked the engine and swerved hard into the adjacent lane, pulling up beside us so quickly I instinctively stepped in front of Grandma. I didn't know what she was about to do, but I could tell it wasn't going to be anything good. She flung the door open, slammed her heels onto the pavement like she wanted the earth to know she was coming, and stomped toward us. Her voice was shrill and shaking with rage, yelling something about old people thinking they own the place, and how the world doesn't stop just because some granny is taking her sweet time. I told her to back off and mind her own business, but she was already inches from my grandma. "You shouldn't even be out here if you can't keep up." She snapped, and before I could stop her, she raised her hand and slapped my grandmother hard. The sound was unreal. It was the kind of sound that echoes not just in the air but in your brain. My body reacted before my thoughts could catch up. I dropped the bags and reached for her, but my grandma, shockingly, held up a hand to stop me. She hadn't fallen. She stood there, stunned but still upright, her cheek turning red with the fresh imprint of this stranger's hand. The woman took a step back, as if realizing for the first time what she had done. But her face was still twisted with self-righteousness, like somehow she thought she was the victim in this. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, pulling my phone out. My hands were shaking. "You just assaulted an elderly woman." "Karen, yes, let's just call her what she is." Karen laughed. She actually laughed. "Please do," she said. "I'll tell them she hit me first. That's how this works, honey. You'll be doing her a favor. Old folks like her need to be put in nursing homes, not out here getting in people's way." She crossed her arms, standing like she had just handed down a royal decree. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe someone could be that casually cruel, that deeply entitled, and that unaware of how badly they had just screwed up. Then my grandma, still holding onto her cane, straightened herself. She didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a slim leather wallet, flipped it open, and held it up toward Cairn. "Retired Detective Sergeant Jean Willis," she said evenly, and I swear to God, Cairn went pale like someone had just drained the blood from her entire head. "You just committed felony assault on a senior citizen, in public in broad daylight with witnesses. And you think you're walking away from this?" Cairn blinked. "That's fake," she said, but her voice had lost all its earlier venom. My grandma didn't respond. She just turned toward the store and called out to the nearest employee standing outside collecting carts. "Can you get your manager? I'd like them to call the precinct and let them know I'm requesting an officer." The employee nodded, stunned, and ran back inside. By now, a few shoppers had stopped nearby, watching everything unfold. One of them was already recording on their phone. Cairn noticed, and her eyes darted back and forth like a trapped animal. She took a step backward toward her SUV, muttering something about how this was ridiculous and she didn't have time for this nonsense. I wasn't shaking anymore. I stood beside my grandma, proud as hell, while the woman who had dared to slap her realized just how massive of a mistake she had made. And in that moment, with the weight of her badge and her composure like armor, my grandma just looked at her and said quietly, "You're going to learn today." And Cairn, for once, had nothing to say. The tension in the parking lot was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cairn stood frozen, staring at my grandma as if unsure whether to double down or run away. The look on her face was a strange mix of disbelief and panic. Clearly, this wasn't going how she expected. In her entitled little world, she was probably used to people backing off, cowering, or apologizing the moment she raised her voice. Maybe she thought she could bully her way through anything with enough venom and volume. But what she hadn't anticipated, what she never could have imagined, was that the woman she chose to assault wasn't just some random frail grandmother. She was a retired detective sergeant who had seen more than her fair share of bullies and criminals, and knew exactly how to handle both. And right now, Grandma wasn't just handling her. She was dismantling her, piece by piece, with nothing more than authority and poise. The store manager came rushing out, followed closely by two floor employees, one of whom was already speaking into a walkie-talkie. The manager was a middle-aged man, tall and wiry, with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Ma'am, we've contacted the local precinct," he said to Grandma, then turned to look at Cairn, who had backed up just far enough to make it clear she was thinking about fleeing. "We've got security footage of the incident. I saw the last part of it with my own eyes. We're going to give the footage to the officers when they arrive." Cairn scoffed loudly, but there was no strength behind it now. Her confidence was evaporating with every word spoken around her. "You people are unbelievable," she muttered, but it was half-hearted. Her mouth kept opening as if she wanted to say more, to justify, to accuse, to twist the situation in her favor, but nothing came out. Grandma adjusted the strap on her handbag and took a slow step forward, her cane tapping gently against the asphalt. "You can try to lie all you want, sweetheart," she said evenly, her voice still as calm as a lake before a storm, "but I know how this works, and you clearly don't. You hit me. You did it in public. You did it in front of witnesses. You tried to lie about it, and now you're thinking about running." Cairn's mouth twisted again, this time into something that might have been intended as a sneer, but it just looked sad. "I didn't try to run," she snapped. "I just don't want to be here while you play pretend with some plastic badge you probably bought online." Grandma didn't even blink. "My badge number is 10,832, she replied instantly. "Retired out of the 7th Precinct, 29 years of service, last commendation awarded in 2015. You can call and verify it. In fact, you should." That was when one of the bystanders, a guy in his 20s with a skateboard tucked under one arm, spoke up. "Yo, I got the whole thing on video. You slapped her, lady. You were screaming at them before that, too." Cairn turned on him, eyes wide. "Mind your business," she hissed, but he shrugged casually, clearly enjoying watching her unravel. "It became my business when I saw you hit an old lady." More phones were out now, more people filming, whispering, murmuring to each other, some openly shaking their heads at Cairn's behavior. The tide had completely turned. She wasn't just losing control of the situation. She was being swallowed by it and she could feel it. Then finally we heard the sirens. Not loud, not blaring, but just enough to announce presence and authority. 2 squad cars rolled up slowly, lights flashing but no sound, and parked at the end of the aisle. The moment they stopped, the air seemed to shift again. Out stepped 2 uniformed officers, and the second one, tall, stocky, clean-shaven, paused when he saw Grandma. Recognition spread across his face like a sunrise. "Sergeant Willis," he called, half smiling, half surprised. "You're the one who called this in." Grandma nodded once, and the younger officer immediately crossed over to us, posture straightening with a mix of respect and concern. "What happened?" he asked, voice low and serious. "She assaulted me," Grandma said simply, jerking her chin toward Cairn. "Unprovoked, in public. I want to press charges." Cairn raised her voice in protest. "She's lying. She hit me first. She threatened me." The officer looked over at her without expression, then glanced at the store manager. "We've got everything on security camera," the manager confirmed. "I can show you the footage inside." The officer nodded and gestured toward Cairn. "Ma'am, we'll need you to stay put for now." Cairn took a half step backward and opened her mouth to protest again, but the officer cut her off. Just don't, stay put." She stopped moving. The manager led the other officer toward the store to get the footage, while the one still with us asked Grandma if she was okay. She nodded, said her face was sore but she was fine otherwise, and declined an ambulance. I stood beside her, still stunned by everything but starting to feel the slow burn of righteous anger rising in my chest. She had slapped my grandmother. She had laid hands on one of the strongest, most respected women I'd ever known, and now she was finally facing the consequences. "Do you want to file a formal complaint?" the officer asked. "Yes," Grandma said without hesitation. "I want her charged with assault and battery on a senior citizen. I'll also be making a formal complaint through the department about her behavior and her attempt to flee the scene. I assume that can be added to the report." The officer just nodded, scribbling quickly on his pad. It didn't take long. 10 minutes later, the other officer returned with a tablet in hand and confirmed that the footage clearly showed Cairn slapping Grandma without any provocation. The officers moved in, informed Cairn she was being placed under arrest, and that's when she lost it completely. "This is insane. She's manipulating you. This is harassment. I'm the victim," she shrieked, pulling back from the officer's grip like a cornered animal. But it was too late. They didn't hesitate. She was cuffed, read her rights, and led toward the squad car as onlookers watched in silence, many still filming. I glanced at Grandma as Cairn was lowered into the backseat, still shouting threats and nonsense. "You okay?" I asked again. She smiled faintly. "I'm fine," she said, "but I'd like to go home and put some ice on my cheek. Maybe a slice of lemon cake wouldn't hurt either." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so her. Even after getting assaulted, even after making a public arrest look like a walk in the park, she still had room for dessert on her mind. That was my grandma. Tough as steel, calm as a summer breeze, and totally, utterly unbothered by idiots like Cairn. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Grandma sat beside me in the passenger seat, holding a cool compress the store manager had given her before we left. It was just a bag of frozen peas wrapped in paper towels, but she pressed it gently to her cheek like it was an old friend. She hadn't said much since the police took Cairn away, and I didn't want to push her to talk. Some moments don't need commentary, they just need room to breathe. I kept glancing over to make sure she was okay, though every time I did, she seemed more amused than injured, her lips twitching like she was trying not to smirk. I could tell she was replaying the whole thing in her head, processing it not just as the woman it happened to, but as a former cop watching an entitled civilian practically beg to get herself arrested. There was a certain poetic justice in it, and while I was still riding the edge of disbelief and anger, Grandma had already moved past that, into the realm of quiet satisfaction. Once we got back to her house, she moved around like nothing had happened. I offered to stay, offered to make tea, offered to call other family members, but she brushed it all off with a wave of her hand. "You worry too much," she said. easing herself into her favorite recliner with the kind of grace only someone with decades of stubborn independence could muster. It's not the first time someone laid a hand on me, and I doubt it'll be the last. But it might be the first time they get jail time for it so publicly. That was the thing about her. She didn't flinch from confrontation, didn't carry bitterness in her voice, didn't even indulge in the kind of theatrical rage most people would consider justified. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for her, loud and clear, and now it was just a matter of letting the process unfold. But I wasn't built like her, not yet. My mind was still buzzing with questions, running scenarios, second-guessing what could have happened if the store hadn't had cameras or if the cops hadn't taken her seriously. What if Karen had gotten away with it? What if no one had filmed? The idea of someone hurting my grandmother and walking off unscathed made my stomach twist. I sat across from her, fidgeting with my phone, and finally asked what had been bothering me all afternoon. Weren't you scared she'd lie? That they'd believe her, that she'd twist it somehow? Grandma looked at me, her eyes steady and calm, and said, "That's always a risk. You can't stop people from lying, but you can make sure you tell the truth louder, longer, and with evidence to back it up. And lucky for us, today we had witnesses and video. That's more than enough." She paused, adjusted the compress on her cheek, and continued. "The real trick is not panicking. People like that Karen types, they thrive on creating chaos. They want to rattle you, make you defensive, force you to act out so they can flip the script. But if you stay calm, if you don't play their game, they run out of moves fast. That woman wasn't prepared for someone like me. She thought I'd cry or beg or cower. She thought I was just another soft target. What she got instead was a wall." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to absorb everything she said. There was a reason she had made it through nearly 3 decades on the force. Not just because she was smart or brave, but because she knew how to control a situation without ever raising her voice. Later that evening, after she finally let me make her a cup of tea and slice her some lemon cake, her landline rang. She picked it up, her tone instantly shifting into what I recognized as her old on-duty voice. "Detective Willis, retired," she said, sitting up straighter in her chair. I watched as her eyes narrowed just slightly, listening intently. It was clear the call was from someone at the precinct. She didn't say much, just nodded occasionally, muttered a few acknowledgments, then finally said, "Thank you, officer. I appreciate the follow-up," before hanging up. I asked her what they said, and she set her tea down before answering. "That was Officer Kelton, the one who recognized me. They've booked her. Official charges are pending, but likely to include misdemeanor battery on a senior citizen, attempted fleeing, and possibly obstruction, depending on how she behaves during processing." I raised my eyebrows. "Obstruction," Grandma smirked. Apparently she screamed the entire way to the station, tried to fake chest pains, and claimed she was having a spiritual attack. They had to bring in a female officer to calm her down. Part of me felt bad laughing, but I couldn't help it. The idea of Karen losing her mind in a holding cell while my grandma calmly sipped tea at home was too much. "Do you think she'll get jail time?" I asked. Grandma shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. First-time offenders sometimes get off with probation or mandatory anger management. But with all the video evidence and witnesses, she'll definitely get a record, and that's going to follow her for a while. Especially if she works in any field that requires background checks." That's when it clicked. She said something about knowing people, about working with kids. Grandma nodded slowly, her expression darkening just slightly. "Then it's even more important this goes through. Someone who thinks it's okay to slap a stranger, an elderly woman, no less, over a parking lot inconvenience shouldn't be anywhere near children. Entitlement like that doesn't stay in one lane." We sat in silence for a bit after that, watching the evening settle over the neighborhood through the window. Grandma's cat, a sleepy gray tabby named Buttons, jumped into her lap and purred loudly, undisturbed by the day's events. It was surreal to think that just hours ago, we were in a shouting match with a stranger, and now we were back in this peaceful little house, surrounded by plants and family photos, sipping tea like nothing had happened. But that was the balance Grandma had mastered, knowing when to fight and knowing when to rest. As the sky darkened and I finished my cake, She finally looked up at me and said, "Tomorrow we'll go about our day like normal. I won't let someone like her ruin my peace, but I'll be damned if I let her forget what she did either." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about an angry woman and a slap. It was about boundaries, about self-respect, and about refusing to be bullied. No matter your age, no matter your pace, no matter how loud someone else tries to be. Grandma had taught me something I didn't even realize I needed to learn, that strength doesn't always look like shouting or fists. Sometimes it looks like a retired cop in a floral blouse, holding frozen peas to her cheek, calmly preparing to press charges with a slice of lemon cake in her hand. The next morning came with a calmness that felt surreal, like the storm had passed but left the sky unnervingly still. I slept on Grandma's couch that night, more for my peace of mind than hers, though she'd rolled her eyes and muttered something about hovering grandchildren. Still, she didn't kick me out. She just made sure I had a spare pillow and blanket, and when I woke up, the smell of bacon was already wafting through the house like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. That's how she dealt with the world. She kept moving forward, same routine, same coffee brewed strong and black, same slippers shuffling across the kitchen floor. But even if her routine hadn't changed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted. The slap might have faded to a mild bruise on her cheek, but what it represented still sat heavy in my mind. I was halfway through my coffee when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at the screen and let out a small, amused breath through her nose. "It's already starting," she said, and I looked up from my cup. "Karen's bail hearing is today. I asked one of my old colleagues to keep me in the loop." She answered the call, put it on speaker, and I listened quietly as the familiar voice of Officer Kelton filled the kitchen. He spoke with that same respectful tone he used the day before, but this time there was something else in it too, barely concealed irritation. "Thought you'd like to know," he said. "Your friend from the parking lot managed to dig herself into a deeper hole overnight. After she was processed, she refused to cooperate, yelled at staff, made threats about suing the department, and claimed she was assaulted by the elderly gang leader." I choked on my coffee while Grandma calmly buttered her toast. "Elderly gang leader," she repeated, like it was the most absurd menu item she'd ever heard. Kelton chuckled. "It gets better. She demanded a phone call, which she used to scream at what sounded like her husband or boyfriend, saying she was the real victim, and the police were biased against white women. That part was recorded. She also made some wild claims about working with children, and said she'd have all of us fired and replaced by the end of the week." My grandmother simply shook her head, unimpressed. "Some people don't know when to shut up and let the system work," Kelton agreed. "The DA's office is leaning toward pushing for a stronger charge. They're considering upgrading to aggravated battery on a senior, depending on whether they can tie in the hate speech from her call." That gave both of us pause. "Hate speech?" I asked, frowning. "It wasn't just the slap, was it?" Kelton sighed. "The video from the store camera and the bystanders caught her saying some things. You didn't hear it at the time because of all the chaos, but she muttered something about you people thinking you're untouchable now, and other garbage like that. It's vague, but the context matters. The DA's office is reviewing it to see if there's any legal weight to it." Grandma didn't respond right away. She just stared out the window, her face unreadable, but I saw something shift in her eyes, a flicker of something cold and hard beneath the surface. It wasn't that she was shocked. It was that she had hoped, maybe foolishly, that the slap was just entitled rage and not something deeper. But now it was starting to look like Karen's venom went beyond frustration. It might have been rooted in something uglier. After Kelton hung up, the rest of the morning passed in a quiet hum of routine. Grandma insisted on going for her morning walk, just to the corner and back, and though I protested, she gave me the look, the one that shut down arguments with surgical precision. So I walked with her, making sure to stay close without making it obvious. She didn't need protection, but I needed the reassurance. As we walked past neighbors' houses, people waved and smiled. Some had seen the viral video already. Yes, it had gone viral. One of the bystanders from the parking lot had uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "Karen slaps grandma, doesn't know she's a retired cop." By the time we got back home, Grandma's name was trending in our town's Facebook group. There were memes, there were fan edits, and someone had already drawn a cartoon version of her holding a pair of handcuffs and looking unimpressed. Buttons the cat had a mini fan base too, for no reason anyone could explain. But even with the internet treating her like some kind of folk hero, Grandma stayed grounded. She didn't want the attention. She didn't bask in it. She kept saying the same thing. It's not about me being famous. It's about making sure people like her don't get away with hurting others. That's the part people didn't always see. Beneath the jokes and calm demeanor was a woman who had spent years fighting for justice, quietly and diligently. She didn't want headlines. She wanted consequences. And now she was getting them, not out of vengeance, but because the system was finally working in her favor for once. Later that afternoon, we got a call from one of Karen's neighbors, or rather, someone who claimed to be her neighbor, reaching out through a local news station looking for context. Apparently, the news had reached Karen's workplace, a private daycare center, and parents had started pulling their kids out once they connected the dots. Her job was on the line. Her husband had reportedly left the house after bailing her out, and according to the gossip grapevine, divorce papers were being drawn up. Grandma just listened, nodding along, but when I asked her how she felt about it, she didn't smile. I feel bad for the kids. I don't feel bad for her. Actions have consequences, and she's just finally meeting hers. And she wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about a slap. This was about someone who thought they could operate above decency, who believed their convenience was more important than someone else's dignity. Karen had chosen violence, literally, and now she was watching her life unravel because of it. Not because Grandma wanted revenge, but because the truth had too many witnesses, too much evidence, and too many people willing to stand up and say, "This isn't okay." That night, as the sunset poured golden light into the living room, Grandma sat with her feet up, cat in her lap, and the remote in her hand. We watched some old detective reruns on TV, the kind she used to say were full of procedural nonsense but good popcorn entertainment. I looked at her, this woman who had faced a slap, a screaming stranger, a legal process and public attention, and still ended the day in the same chair, with the same steady heartbeat and calm expression. She turned to me at one point as the show cut to commercial and said, "You know, I didn't expect all this. I just wanted to get my groceries. But sometimes the world needs to be reminded that you can't treat people like they're in your way, especially not people like me." And with that, she turned back to the TV, unbothered as ever, while the rest of the world caught up to her truth. The following week unfolded like a strange dream, part courtroom drama, part viral spectacle, part quiet reckoning that seemed to ripple far beyond the parking lot where it had all started. Grandma remained remarkably unfazed through it all, her usual rhythm of life uninterrupted even as the world around her buzzed with attention. She took her morning walks, tended to her tomato plants, and refused every single interview request that came her way. News vans had even cruised through the neighborhood a few times, hopping to catch her outside, but she simply waved them off and went on with her day. "This isn't a circus," she muttered one morning as we peeked through the curtains at a reporter lingering by their van, camera in hand. "I'm not putting on a show. I already did what needed to be done." Despite her best efforts to ignore the noise, the case still moved forward swiftly. The combination of video evidence, multiple eyewitnesses, and Karen's own unhinged behavior post-arrest left the prosecutors with an airtight case. Karen's lawyer, from what we gathered, had tried to push for a deal, probation, community service, a public apology, but the DA wasn't having it. Maybe it was the audacity of the crime. Maybe it was the brazenness of Karen's behavior during booking, or maybe it was just that someone finally stood up and said, "No more." Whatever the reason, the charge of misdemeanor battery was officially upgraded to aggravated battery on a senior citizen, a more serious offense that came with potential jail time and couldn't be scrubbed clean with a few hours of picking up trash on the side of the road. Grandma was called in to give a formal statement for the court. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for sympathy or dramatize what happened. She recounted the slap, the way Karen spoke to her, and the aftermath with clinical precision, a lifetime of taking down statements kicking in without effort. The young prosecutor seemed both impressed and slightly intimidated by her, scribbling notes quickly as Grandma delivered her testimony like she was back in an interrogation room, reading someone their rights. When we left the courthouse that afternoon, Grandma paused on the steps, took in the crisp spring air, and said, "It feels good knowing she'll face real consequences, not just some internet backlash. Justice should be more than viral fame. It should mean something." On sentencing day, we decided to attend, even though Grandma technically wasn't required to be there. She said it wasn't about watching Karen squirm, though she admitted there was some satisfaction in that. It was about seeing the process through to the end. "When someone wrongs you publicly, you hold them accountable just as publicly," she told me, buttoning up her coat with a quiet steadiness that said she wasn't interested in revenge, only closure. The courtroom was half full, a strange mix of reporters, court officials, and a few people who had apparently followed the case online and wanted to see how it would end. Karen sat at the defendant's table, no longer smug or self-righteous. She looked tired. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the bags under her eyes, and her hair, which had been pulled back into a sleek ponytail during her tantrum in the parking lot, now hung limp and uneven. The woman who had once shouted that old people should get out of the way now looked like someone desperately trying to fade into the wallpaper. The judge read through the charges, citing the damning evidence and Karen's behavior during detainment. There was no dramatic reading of the riot act, no pounding of the gavel in righteous fury, just a clear, deliberate statement of facts and a measured reminder that assaulting a senior citizen was not only illegal but deeply inhumane. When Karen was given a chance to speak, she mumbled an apology that lacked any sincerity, her voice barely audible over the courtroom's hushed silence. She didn't apologize to Grandma directly. She didn't admit she was wrong. She just said she was stressed and hadn't been herself lately, a flimsy excuse that didn't move anyone. The judge sentenced her to 90 days in county jail plus a year of probation and mandatory anger management classes. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was more than a slap on the wrist. It would follow her. It would affect her future. And most importantly, it set a precedent. Actions have consequences. After the sentencing, as we walked back toward the car, a few people tried to approach Grandma for comments, but she politely declined. "I've said what needed saying," she told them. "The rest is up to her. Whether she learns from this or not, that's on her." In the car, she finally let out a long breath, the kind that comes after holding in tension you didn't even realize you had. "It's over," she said. "And now I can go back to being invisible in parking lots just how I like it." We both laughed, the first real laugh since this whole thing had begun. It felt good. It felt final. Over the next few days, the online storm began to die down. New stories took the spotlight, new scandals erupted, and the world, as it always does, moved on. But in our little corner of the world, things felt different. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a polite hello now stopped by to drop off pies or just to chat. A few kids from down the street drew Grandma a crayon picture of her with a cape and a badge, calling her Super Granny. She hung it on the fridge with pride. I think, in some ways, this whole ordeal reminded people that strength doesn't always come with volume or violence. It can come in the form of grace, patience, and the unwavering demand to be treated with dignity. As for Grandma, she went back to her life. She didn't let the slap define her. She didn't cling to it. But she also didn't forget it, and she made sure no one else did either. She used it as a reminder, to herself, to me, and to anyone who would listen, that no one has the right to treat others like they're less just because they walk a little slower or take up a little more time. That day in the parking lot, Karen thought she was dealing with a fragile old woman. What she got was a force of nature wrapped in cardigan sweaters and sensible shoes. A retired cop with steel in her spine and the law on her side. And I'll never forget the last thing Grandma said to me as we stood in the kitchen a few nights later, sipping tea like always. Some people see gray hair and think weakness. They forget we're the ones who built the roads they're speeding down. Sometimes they need to be reminded, gently or not so gently. Then she winked, lifted her mug in a mock toast, and added, to slow walkers and fast justice. And with that, the story ended exactly the way it should have, quietly, firmly, and with Grandma in full command of her peace.